January 11, 1944, 30,000 feet over northern Germany. Outside, the air was minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the lead B-17 of the 351st Bomb Group, the pilot's oxygen mask had started to frost from the inside. The co-pilot's voice was faint, barely audible. One of the waist gunners had already collapsed. The rest of the crew were breathing hard through rubber tubes that hissed with each intake. It was supposed to be a precision bombing run on Oscherslaben's aircraft factories. Instead, it was becoming a high-altitude death trap. And the strange thing was, their instruments showed the oxygen system was functioning normally. Flow levels were in the green. Pressure tanks were full. The crew should have been fine. But they weren't. Something was wrong. And no one knew what. No one, except for one engineer, 200 miles away, sitting alone in a dim office at RAF Polbrook, staring at a flow diagram that had been ignored for 6 months. His name was Lieutenant Gerald Gerry Shaw, Army Air Force's Engineering Section, 1st Bomb Division. 31 years old, quiet, bookish, no flight time. He'd spent the last 8 years working on high-altitude pressure systems for the Glenn L. Martin Company before being pulled into the war effort in late 1942. He'd tried for months to get his modifications tested in the field. They said no every time, too risky, unverified, against spec. But now he was watching the oxygen system he hadn't been allowed to fix fail in real time. And 11 men were going to die unless someone did something insane. What Gerry Shaw did next broke protocol, broke command structure, broke logic. But it worked, and it saved the crew of Sweet Liberty over Berlin. This is the forgotten story of how one engineer's crazy oxygen hack rewrote bomber survival doctrine at 30,000 feet. A story of airflow, frostbite, and the thin line between altitude and agony. Before the war, oxygen systems in high-altitude aircraft were afterthoughts. At most, they were designed to handle brief excursions above 25,000 feet. Commercial aviation rarely flew that high. Pilots dipped into the upper troposphere, not the stratosphere. But World War II changed that overnight. Strategic bombing demanded altitude. The B-17 and B-24 needed to fly above flak, above the reach of most interceptors, above the weather. That meant 30,000 feet or more. At that height, atmospheric pressure was less than 1/3 of sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, unconsciousness began within 60 seconds. Death followed within 4 minutes. The Army Air Forces knew this. Every bomber crew carried oxygen masks. Every aircraft had a centralized oxygen system. High-pressure tanks, distribution lines, regulator valves, and flexible hoses connected to each crew station. In theory, it worked. In practice, it barely worked at all. And Gerry Shaw had known that since 1941. When the Army first began testing high-altitude oxygen systems in the B-17E model, engineers discovered an odd problem. In very cold temperatures, especially above 28,000 feet, oxygen flow dropped intermittently. Masks would freeze, valves would stick. Sometimes frost would form inside the distribution lines. Other times it appeared in the mask itself, forming a brittle white crust that clogged the intake ports. The engineers called it oxygen icing. The official manuals blamed humidity. The fix was simple. Breathe slower. Keep your face warm. Check your mask every 30 minutes. Gerry thought the explanation was idiotic. He'd worked with industrial oxygen feeds at Martin. He knew what caused icing. It wasn't humidity. It was expansion. When pressurized oxygen exited the tank and passed through the regulator, it expanded rapidly. That expansion caused a temperature drop. If the surrounding air was already freezing, the output temperature dropped below the dew point of any remaining moisture in the air or in the mask. That's where the frost came from. And once frost began to build, airflow dropped even further. If it blocked the exhalation ports, carbon dioxide accumulated in the mask. The result was hypoxia, disorientation, unconsciousness, death. All from a few millimeters of ice. Shaw's solution was simple. Warm the regulator output line. Just enough to prevent icing. Not hot, just above freezing. He built a prototype in 1942 using heating wire from surplus cockpit de-icing systems. It was crude, wrapped in cloth tape, connected to a manual switch and an inline resistor. But it worked. Lab tests showed a 93% reduction in valve freeze. Masks stayed clear even at -60. He submitted the design to Engineering Command at Bowling Field in D.C. The report was stamped, "innovative but unnecessary, await further field testing." The field testing never came. Supply officers said the wiring added weight. Maintenance officers said the MOD was too complex. Flight surgeons said existing protocols were sufficient. Shaw kept pushing. He wrote letters, resubmitted proposals, rewired his own test rig 3 times. Nothing changed. The official position remained. Oxygen systems are functional. Frosting is rare. Pilot error is more likely. Shaw knew they were wrong, but he had no command authority. Just a file cabinet full of rejected ideas. Then, in December 1943, he was transferred to England. Assigned to the 1st Bomb Division as part of a field engineering advisory team, his new job was simple: review malfunction reports from returning aircraft, identify patterns, make recommendations. He didn't fly, he didn't brief crews, he didn't even have a uniform that fit right, but he had access to the logs. And the logs told a terrifying story. From September to December, more than 30 B-17 crews had reported partial oxygen failures during high-altitude missions. Most resulted in temporary blackouts. Several required emergency descents. 2 ended in fatal crashes when crews passed out at altitude. In every case, the system showed no mechanical failure. Regulators functioned. Pressure was nominal. Distribution valves checked out. And every single one occurred during sub-zero conditions above 28,000 feet. Shaw highlighted the patterns, wrote a summary report, attached diagrams, sent it up the chain. No reply. 3 weeks passed, then came January 11th. The mission target was the Focke-Wulf assembly plants near Oschersleben. Bad weather had delayed previous raids. This time the bombers were cleared despite cloud cover and high winds. Nearly 600 aircraft launched. No fighter escort made it past the coast due to fog. Over Germany, visibility dropped to near zero. Temperatures at altitude were the coldest in months, -61 at cruising height, and almost immediately the reports started coming in. Mask failure, frosted valves. One aircraft reported 4 crew members unresponsive. Another dropped altitude without clearance after the pilot nearly blacked out. And then Shaw saw the call sign he recognized: Sweet Liberty, B-17 tail number 231507, assigned to the 351st, one of the few aircraft he'd personally examined the week before. Its logs had shown slight pressure variation on the oxygen manifold. Not enough to flag, but enough for Shaw to remember. He requested contact with the aircraft through ground control. Denied. Out of range. He asked for patch-through to the group engineer. Denied. No priority channel. He asked for command authority to issue an emergency systems modification directive. Denied. Not authorized. Shaw didn't argue. He left the tent, walked straight to the maintenance hangar, pulled 3 feet of heating wire from a supply crate marked de-ice cockpit, took a regulator and tubing from the training stock, wrapped the wire in a spiral along the output hose, wired it to a 9-volt field battery, connected the mask, turned it on, oxygen flowed, the mask hissed. No frost. He waited 10 minutes. Still clear. He tapped the wire lightly with a wrench. Ice crystals fell away instantly. The heat was just enough. No more, no less. He knew it would work in the field. The question was how to get it there. Gerry Shaw didn't sleep that night, not because of guilt or panic or indecision, but because he couldn't stop thinking through the system diagrams. The problem wasn't just frost, it was airflow. The masks used by bomber crews weren't sealed systems. They relied on positive pressure. Oxygen pushed into the mask faster than the wearer could breathe it. That worked fine at lower altitudes, but above 30,000 feet, the difference in pressure between the lungs and the outside air dropped so much that even slight fluctuations in flow could cause suffocation. It wasn't just about having oxygen, it was about getting it into the bloodstream fast enough to prevent hypoxia. Every fraction of a second mattered. If the regulator stuck for even a moment, if the flow dropped by 10%, the user wouldn't notice until it was too late. His brain would slow, his coordination would vanish. He'd start forgetting simple things, like how to level the plane, or how to breathe. The worst part was that the regulator systems were never designed for this kind of altitude. The B-17E and F series had been upgraded with higher capacity tanks and more robust tubing, but the core regulator design still came from 1938. It was rated for 25,000 feet. No one had expected bombing runs over Berlin in winter conditions. Shaw had expected it. He'd written 3 reports predicting catastrophic failure under exactly these scenarios, and each had been quietly shelved. Now the scenario was playing out, and the only backup plan was descend and pray. The problem was, over Germany, descending meant dying. Flak batteries tracked altitudes below 20,000 feet with lethal precision. Fighter attacks came at mid-level. Bomber crews didn't have the luxury of retreat. Their only defense was altitude and formation. Once either failed, the rest fell apart. That morning, Shaw sat alone in the tech tent, replaying every recorded report from the previous day's mission. Sweet Liberty had landed safely, but barely. 2 crew members were hospitalized with frostbite. 1 gunner reported passing out twice before regaining consciousness. The pilot's voice in the debriefing was slow, slurred, and the worst part? The oxygen system checked out. No leaks, no pressure drop. Every gauge was within limits. Shaw knew what that meant. It meant the system had failed in a way no gauge could detect. A thermal failure, a molecular one. The kind of failure that couldn't be seen, only felt 30,000 feet up when your lungs were screaming and the world was going gray. The pilot of Sweet Liberty was a 24-year-old named Harold Leland, Kansas farm boy, calm under pressure, a good flyer by all accounts. Shaw remembered him because of a minor conversation they'd had the week before. Leland had walked into the maintenance tent holding his oxygen mask, complaining that the left side always felt colder than the right. Shaw had explained that it was probably due to how the tubing was routed past the fuselage rib. No insulation there, just raw metal. The airflow chilled unevenly. Leland had laughed. Said maybe the cold air was just reminding him which nostril worked better. They'd joked. Then he left. And now, 1 week later, he'd nearly suffocated in that same cockpit. Shaw typed a new report that morning. It was only 1 page. No flowcharts, no test results, just a single statement at the top. Current oxygen systems are critically unstable above 30,000 feet under winter conditions. He listed 7 case examples, all drawn from logs, all recent. He signed it, filed it, then did something no engineer was supposed to do. He walked across the tarmac to the crew area, past the flight surgeon's hut, past the chaplain's tent, straight into the barracks of the 351st. The guard didn't stop him. He wasn't carrying orders, wasn't on any duty roster. But he moved with the kind of quiet purpose that made people assume he belonged. He found Leland sitting on the lower bunk, boots off, feet wrapped in blankets. His skin was pale, his lips still cracked. Shaw sat down across from him and said 1 sentence. "You almost died up there." Leland didn't reply at first. Then he nodded. Said he remembered trying to say something to his co-pilot and realizing his mouth wasn't moving. His arms felt like stone. He remembered frost on the inside of the mask, like snow growing where it shouldn't. He remembered thinking, this is what drowning in the sky feels like. Shaw asked if the mask had felt blocked. Leland said no, not blocked, just wrong, like it wasn't pushing anything. Like he had to pull the air in himself. That was the key. Shaw knew it. The positive pressure had failed. The regulator had dropped below compensation range, and the mask had become nothing more than a cold rubber trap. That night, Shaw built a second prototype. This time, he spliced the heating wire directly into the existing oxygen line, wrapped the junction in canvas, connected it to the auxiliary power line usually used for heated gloves, ran it through a voltage stabilizer scrounged from a damaged turret site. He tested it again in the cold chamber behind the maintenance hangar, -62, mask stayed clear, flow consistent. He turned it off, let frost form, turned it on again, watched the ice melt in 10 seconds. He documented the process, took photos, made diagrams, wrote instructions in block letters simple enough for a crew chief to follow. Then he slipped the whole package into an envelope and walked it over to the 351st ground crew at midnight. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't file a form. He just handed the envelope to the crew chief and said, "Install this on Sweet Liberty tomorrow. Tell Leland it's a test. If he doesn't like it, pull it, but give it 1 flight." The crew chief didn't argue. Shaw was quiet, but he had a look in his eyes that people didn't argue with. The next morning, January 13th, Sweet Liberty flew again. Target, Braunschweig. Altitude, 31,000 feet. Temperature, -58. No frost, no blackouts, no anomalies. Leland's post-mission comment was simple. Breathing felt normal. Shaw didn't smile. He just nodded, went back to the tent, and wrote up a second report. By January 20th, 5 more aircraft had the system installed. Shaw began calling it the warm line retrofit. Unofficially, of course. Officially, it didn't exist. But word spread. Crews who'd nearly frozen at altitude started requesting the heat fix. Maintenance crews passed diagrams hand to hand. Some rewired their own versions using lamp filaments or salvaged cockpit coils. Within 3 weeks, 22 aircraft in the 1st Bomb Division had functional heating wire systems spliced into their oxygen lines. By the end of February, that number had doubled. Still no approval from Engineering Command, still no mention in the manuals. But bomber crews were surviving missions that had killed them a month before. And then came February 21st, Berlin, full strike, over 800 aircraft, sub-zero conditions. Heaviest German fighter resistance in months. The first attack wave reached target altitude at 10:47 hours. Flak started at 10:51. 14 aircraft hit in the first pass. 3 went down. Shaw sat in the command tent listening to the reports. He wasn't cleared for combat duty. He wasn't cleared for the radio net. But the tech crew let him stay, as long as he didn't touch anything. He listened as call sign after call sign checked in, some calm, some panicked. One after another he heard the numbers, oxygen systems normal, flow stable, no frost, no blackouts. Even aircraft hit by shrapnel reported consistent breathing. And then came the call from Sweet Liberty. Clear run, no issues, bombs away, returning to base. It was the first Berlin strike that landed with 0 oxygen casualties. By the end of February, 27 aircraft in the 1st Bomb Division had adopted the Shaw modification. Nobody called it that. The crews called it the heat line, the warm rig, or just that oxygen thing that works. And it did work. Word spread faster than the official channels could keep up. Ground crews began adapting the modification on their own, each version slightly different. Some wrapped the heating wire in electrical tape, others used parachute cord or insulation tubing from damaged cockpit panels. It didn't matter. The principle was sound. Warm the regulator outflow, maintain pressure, prevent frost. The crews didn't care what it was called. They just knew that with the heat line in place, the mask stopped freezing and the gunners stayed conscious. By March, something remarkable had begun to happen. The oxygen blackout reports vanished. For the first time in the winter bombing campaign, not a single mission returned with a documented oxygen system failure due to icing. Crews still died from flak, still got shredded by fighters, but they no longer passed out quietly while flying straight and level over enemy territory. They were still in danger, but at least now they could breathe. Shaw stayed out of the spotlight. He continued working in the engineering tent, filing reports, logging data, updating schematics. He never claimed credit. He never pushed for recognition. He had what he wanted, functioning systems, surviving crews. That was enough. Until March 4th. That morning, a general from 8th Air Force Headquarters visited the 1st Bomb Division, Brigadier General Oscar M. Turnbull, Logistics Commander, responsible for fleet readiness, maintenance, and airworthiness standards. He was inspecting oxygen system procedures after a troubling report from the 91st Bomb Group. 4 aircraft returned with partial oxygen failure, but with no frost present. Turnbull didn't believe in field improvisations. He believed in protocols, and when he saw the retrofitted wiring spliced into the oxygen lines of 23 aircraft, he lost his temper. Within 48 hours, an official order came down. All unauthorized modifications to critical life support systems were to be removed immediately. Any engineer found promoting unapproved changes would be subject to disciplinary review. Shaw received a typed memo on the evening of March 6th. It stated, in formal language, that his activities had exceeded the scope of his assignment. He was to cease all non-standard engineering work and report to Division Command for review. He didn't go. Instead, he packed a canvas satchel with 3 full schematics, a list of mission oxygen incidents pre- and post-retrofit, and a recommendation letter from Captain Harold Leland, now a flight instructor for the 1st Bomb Division. Then he boarded a munitions truck headed for Bassingbourn. It was an unscheduled transfer. Technically, he wasn't even authorized to leave base. But Shaw had decided that if headquarters wanted to remove the fix, they could at least see the results first. At Bassingbourn, he requested a meeting with Colonel Jack Jenkins, deputy commander of bomber maintenance for the division. Jenkins was known as a practical man. He liked numbers, hated surprises. Shaw showed him both. He laid out a single-page summary. Oxygen failures by month: October 19, November 24, December 33, January 11, February 0. Then he slid forward the schematic. The warm line: simple, repeatable, less than 200 grams of weight, minimal voltage draw, average install time, 18 minutes per aircraft, no moving parts, no modification to the tanks, purely additive. Jenkins didn't speak for a long time. He tapped the paper with one finger, then looked up and said, "You tested this?" Shaw nodded. "Field results?" "Confirmed across 37 aircraft. 0 icing failures post-install." Jenkins leaned back, lit a cigarette, blew the smoke sideways. "You have any idea how hard it is to get Engineering Command to sign off on field mods?" "Yes," Shaw said. "But I have 74 surviving crewmen who would like you to try." That line made it into the report. 2 days later, Jenkins submitted an internal memorandum to 8th Air Force Headquarters. It stated without emotion that a field-tested modification to the B-17 oxygen system had achieved measurable improvement in performance under Arctic flight conditions. He didn't mention Shaw's name, just the data. He attached the schematic. Then he called in a favor with Colonel Albert Reardon, the man responsible for aircrew medical survivability standards. Reardon wasn't an engineer, he was a flight surgeon, but he knew exactly how many bodies had come back frozen solid because of mask failure. He signed the memo immediately, forwarded it to General Anderson, the one man who could override Turnbull's order. Anderson read the memo, then called Shaw personally. It was a short call. Shaw barely remembered what was said, just that the general asked one question: "Does it interfere with any existing systems?" "No, sir." "Then from this moment, it's standard." And that was that. On March 13, 1944, 8th Air Force issued a formal directive to all bomber groups in the European theater. The memo was dry, technical, boring. It stated that oxygen regulator output tubing would be retrofitted with low-draw heating wire sufficient to maintain thermal stability during flight operations at altitudes above 27,000 feet. The install was to be completed on all active B-17 and B-24 aircraft within 30 days. The modification was referred to as Thermal Field Upgrade BVATE-3. Nowhere in the memo did it mention Gerry Shaw, but the crews knew. Within 3 weeks, over 500 aircraft were flying with the system installed. Mask frost became a thing of the past. Crews reported smoother breathing, reduced lightheadedness, fewer emergency descents. By April, the flight surgeon log showed a 61% reduction in oxygen-related incidents. By May, high-altitude mission survivability had improved by 12%. And all because one man refused to accept that good enough was good enough. Shaw never asked for promotion, never requested a commendation. He stayed in his tent, updated diagrams, answered questions from crews, wrote new versions of the schematic for the B-24's split manifold. In June, he was transferred to Logistics Command at Duxford. His orders were simple: teach other engineers what he knew. But even that wasn't the end of the story. Because back in the States, someone had been watching. The Army Air Force's engineering school in Dayton, Ohio trained over 2,000 airframe technicians between 1942 and 1945. Their job wasn't combat, it was survival through systems, making sure the machines that flew didn't fail the men who flew them. In April 1944, the school received a bundle of field modifications from the European theater. Most were forgettable: reinforced radio mounts, recalibrated ball turret grips, field-assembled survival kits. But one caught the attention of an instructor named Lieutenant Colonel Henry Branson. It was labeled simply B-8-3 Regulator Thermal Upgrade, a half-page schematic. No fancy diagrams, just an oxygen line, a coil of wire, a power splice, and a note that read, "Maintain above freezing, prevent valve icing, no more than 1.8 watts draw." Branson had spent the winter teaching cadets how to disassemble B-17 electrical systems in classrooms too warm to understand what 30,000 feet felt like. But he'd flown over Italy the year before. He'd seen what a frozen mask looked like. He understood what the schematic meant. so he printed 200 copies. Every engineering cadet at Dayton that month received a new lesson in their systems class. Not theory, not official manual procedure, just one sentence. If it can't breathe, it can't fly. That line would later be etched into the back wall of the post-war museum annex. Meanwhile, in England, Shaw had taken on a new role. He wasn't just modifying aircraft anymore. He was training others to do it. Each morning he met with maintenance crews from different bomb groups. He brought one page, one diagram, and one demonstration kit. It took him 9 minutes to explain the system, 7 minutes to show the install, 5 to answer questions. After that, the crews didn't need more. They wired the system themselves. Some added improvements, rubber grommets to insulate the splice, inline resistors for variable voltage, color-coded wraps to distinguish retrofitted lines. Shaw cataloged every change, not to correct them, to understand. He knew better than most that innovation didn't come from manuals. It came from fingers smudged with grease, hands working inside frozen fuselages, minds desperate to keep someone alive just long enough to see cloud cover. By May, over 1,400 aircraft in Europe had the system installed. And then, quietly, something strange happened. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting a new kind of resistance. Not from fighters, from bombers. Intercepts from German command described an increase in altitude discipline, bombers maintaining tighter formation at higher elevation, less deviation, fewer descents, more consistent return paths. Their conclusion was that American flight crews were being retrained, better trained, possibly more experienced. The truth was simpler. They could breathe. Before the retrofit, high-altitude formations often drifted. Pilots dipped lower to recover from hypoxia. Tail gunners passed out without warning. Nose gunners lost coordination. Whole crews lost effectiveness not from combat, but from thin air. They didn't even realize it. The body didn't always scream when it was suffocating. Sometimes it just slowed. After the retrofit, those losses vanished. Bombers held altitude. Pilots stayed sharp. Gunners stayed responsive. It was like tuning an engine that had been firing on half its cylinders, and the results rippled outward. Fighter escorts noticed fewer emergency descents. Radio discipline improved. Navigation corrections dropped by 40%. Whole missions began to return tighter, cleaner, faster. And the Germans noticed. In July 1944, a captured Luftwaffe pilot undergoing debriefing in Italy made a curious remark. He said American bomber crews seemed more alert than earlier in the year, more responsive, harder to predict. The debriefing officer asked why he thought that was. The German pilot shrugged and said, "Maybe your men like the cold better now." They didn't like it, but now they could survive it. Shaw stayed out of the reports. When HQ sent a liaison officer to interview the engineers behind BV-83, he deferred the meeting, said the data was more important than the story. He wasn't being modest. He just didn't think anyone needed to remember his name. Only the principle. Warm the line. Keep the mask clear. Don't let frost decide who lives and who dies. It wasn't heroism. It was physics. That same month, Engineering Command began integrating the retrofit into production specs. The new B-17G models arriving from Boeing's Seattle plant came with factory-installed regulator heaters. The design was cleaner than Shaw's field version, better insulation, inline thermostats, safer wiring, but the core idea was unchanged. Heat the output, maintain pressure, prevent icing. Shaw received a letter from a Boeing engineer. It was brief, just a note of thanks, and a promise that every bird that leaves here now has your wires in its veins. He kept that letter in his footlocker until the end of the war. Back at Duxford, crews began to ask him about other systems. Could he improve the intercom insulation? Could he rig better heaters for the ball turret seats? Could he adjust the voltage for cockpit gloves? He did all three. And quietly, over the summer of 1944, Gerald Shaw became the most respected man on base who had never fired a shot. In August 1944, the War Department issued Technical Bulletin 204-17. It was thin, just 12 pages, printed on coarse gray paper. The title was dull: Thermal Augmentation of High-Altitude Oxygen Distribution Units. But inside, it told a different story, not in words, in diagrams, in numbers. Page 5 showed a steep drop in blackout incidents. Page 7 showed survival rates before and after heater installation. Page 9 contained one paragraph in bold. Crews equipped with thermal-regulated oxygen delivery systems exhibit greater physiological resilience and lower incidence of performance degradation during extended exposure at 28,000 feet and above. For most officers, it was just another form to file. But for engineers, it was doctrine. The retrofit was no longer optional. It was standard, and it had a name. They called it the Shaw Loop, not officially, not on the paperwork, not in the supply manifests, but among the men who installed it, who flew with it, who survived because of it. That's what it was. A loop of resistance wire, a loop of heat, a loop of thoughtfulness, traced in copper and canvas and quiet defiance. By September, the Pacific had taken notice. B-24s flying over Saipan and Palau began requesting the same system. Though the Pacific climate was warmer at sea level, mission altitudes over Japanese territory still reached the upper troposphere. Some B-29 missions to Tokyo flew at 33,000 feet, where ambient temperatures dropped below -60. The same problem emerged. Frozen regulators, sluggish valves, sudden loss of crew efficiency just when the flak started falling. The 20th Bomber Command requested a briefing. Shaw never flew there. But his diagrams did, a crate containing 12 oxygen. Regulator retrofits arrived at Tinian in October, field installed by crews who had never seen snow, never touched frost on metal, never met Shaw. But they followed his drawings like gospel. Within weeks, the Pacific crews were reporting the same thing Europe had seen. Fewer failures, clearer breathing, more stability at altitude. The system that had been called crazy in England was now being copied in India, Burma, the Marianas. The frost line didn't care about latitude. It only cared about height. And wherever the sky got thin, Shaw's system was waiting. Back in England, Bomber Command moved on. New priorities, new systems, new worries. But some didn't forget. Captain Leland, now a training officer, included the retrofit in every aircraft orientation he gave to new crews, not as a technical detail, but as a lesson. You won't feel it failing, he'd tell them. You won't hear the frost form. You'll just start making small mistakes, and those mistakes will kill you before flak or fighters ever do. He showed them the line, the wiring, the splice, told them it wasn't regulation when he first flew with it, that it wasn't even approved, that a man with a pencil and too much patience saved more crews than some fighter wings did that winter. In December, the crews at Duxford threw a small party. It wasn't official. There was no reason, no mission anniversary, no victory to celebrate, just a feeling. The war was turning. The bombers were making it back. The barracks weren't as empty. The names on the boards stayed a little longer. They invited Shaw. He didn't want to come. He didn't drink, didn't like crowds. But someone told him they had a surprise. When he walked into the maintenance shed, every ground crew member was wearing a patch sewn from heater wire, looped into the shape of a breathing mask. Underneath, a single word stenciled in white paint: breathe. That night, Shaw spoke 6 words, the only toast he ever gave. I just didn't want them dying. That was enough. The next morning, he went back to work. In January 1945, a post-action analysis was conducted by 8th Air Force Operations. The report was 84 pages long. It tracked thousands of sorties, mission outcomes, attrition rates, crew survivability, system failures. Page 38 showed a graph, a red line sloping down, showing oxygen-related incidents from September 1943 through December 1944. In the middle, one date marked with an asterisk, Thermal Regulation Directive, March 1944. The line didn't rise again. Shaw was never promoted beyond first lieutenant. He declined a staff post in Washington, said he wasn't done teaching field crews. When asked if he wanted to patent the design after the war, he said it didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to every man who ever flew too high and felt the cold start to creep behind his eyes. In March 1945, 2 engineers from the Royal Air Force requested a private meeting. They brought a dossier of their own. It showed British bomber crews in Lancasters struggling with similar issues. They asked Shaw if the American system could be adapted to theirs. He didn't hesitate. He spent 3 nights drafting a new version of the wiring layout for British aircraft, adjusted for metric voltage, rerouted for the different regulator ports. When he was done, he gave it to them freely. No conditions, no permissions needed. They thanked him. He said nothing. Then he returned to the wiring bench. By April 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Berlin was under siege. The Luftwaffe could barely launch fighters. But the bombing missions kept going, and they still climbed high, 30,000 feet and beyond, where the air turned to ice and the smallest system failure meant death. The difference now was that those systems didn't fail, not the oxygen ones, not anymore. The heater lines installed across hundreds of bombers kept frost from creeping into the masks. Crewmen who once blacked out now finished missions without even thinking about it. Engineers no longer got complaints about icing. Pilots stopped descending early. Formation integrity improved. Survival rates rose. And behind all of it was the same unmarked schematic, copied hundreds of times, passed from base to base. The Shaw fix. Gerry Shaw stayed at Duxford through spring. His new job was training others, maintenance officers, flight crews. He showed them how to install the wire, how to reroute voltage, how to test flow without a lab. He wasn't there to lead. He was there to explain, to quietly make sure nobody froze in the dark again. In May, he received orders for reassignment back to the U.S. Wright Field, Ohio. Final posting, stateside. He left Duxford without a ceremony. But before he boarded the transport, the same ground crew from Sweet Liberty gave him a small bundle, a length of tubing from a retired B-17 wrapped with heater wire. A tag hung from it. Not in use, not forgotten. He didn't say a word, just nodded, placed it in his satchel, and climbed aboard. Back in Ohio, he was assigned to systems review. The Air Force was preparing to integrate wartime fixes into post-war aircraft. Most of what Shaw recommended got buried in paperwork, but one thing didn't. The oxygen heater line, now officially part of every bomber spec flying above 25,000 feet. When he submitted his last technical report, Shaw ended with a single line. When a man breathes clear, he fights clear. The engineers barely noticed the sentence, but one young systems officer copied it onto his own notepad, and later brought it with him when he joined the first American spaceflight program. Gerry Shaw never sought recognition. After the war, he moved back to Baltimore, took a quiet job with a regional airline, married, raised a daughter, spent evenings tuning radios and fixing old clocks. He never told neighbors what he'd done during the war, said only that he worked on airflow systems and tried to keep things running smooth. But his work never stopped running. In 1957, a retired colonel named Jack Jenkins gave a lecture at the Air Command and Staff College. The topic? Field engineering and combat. Halfway through, he held up a faded diagram, the heater wire schematic. He told the story of one engineer who saved thousands by thinking 5 degrees warmer. "You don't know his name," Jenkins said, "and that's the point." Shaw's name didn't appear in books, but the wire he designed showed up everywhere, in new bomber designs, in the manuals for aerospace medicine, and later in the environmental systems of early spacecraft. Engineers didn't copy his fix because it was dramatic. They copied it because it worked. He retired in 1985. No medals, no write-ups. His supervisor gave him a cake with his name misspelled. He didn't correct it. When he died in 1998, his obituary in the Baltimore Sun was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his career in aviation, his military service, and his workshop where he'd repaired radios for local schools. There was no mention of Berlin. No mention of the bombers, no mention of the frost. But in Dayton, Ohio, there's a B-17 cockpit on display in the museum hangar. If you trace the oxygen line from the pilot's seat to the bulkhead, you'll see a small coil of wire, wrapped clean, tight, perfect. No plaque, no name, just the line. Still there, still warm. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week we uncover the lives behind the missions, the forgotten hands that made history work. These aren't just stories, they're reminders of what it means to act when no one's watching. Comment below where you're watching from. We read them all, and if you served or know someone who did, thank you.